What if the most dangerous moment in a family's life wasn't the crime itself, but the moment someone decided to talk? Let me ask you something right now. If the person accused of killing his own father suddenly claimed he wasn't alone, would you want to know the names? Or would you be afraid of what those names might do to your understanding of power, loyalty, and truth? Because in tonight's story, a fictional, dramatized reconstruction told in the style of a true crime expose, everything hinges on a list. A list that, according to the narrative we're about to unfold, was never meant to be seen, never meant to be read aloud, and never meant to include the people it allegedly did. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't a police report. It isn't a court transcript. It's a chilling what if, built around the kind of stories that spread when silence fractures and fear starts bargaining for survival. Picture this. A quiet, wealthy neighborhood. A family known more for influence than intimacy. An estate so large it can hide secrets in plain sight. And a moment that turns a private tragedy into a public obsession. In the fictional timeline of this story, two elderly parents are found dead inside their home. The details are disturbing, but what matters most isn't how they died. It's what followed. Because almost immediately, the attention didn't stay on the loss. It shifted to the son. The son who lived on the property. The son who had his own space, his own isolation, his own complicated relationship with the people who raised him. The son whose name suddenly dominated every headline, every whispered conversation, every speculative thread online. And here's where the story becomes unsettling. According to this dramatized narrative, the son didn't deny everything. He didn't offer a clean, simple explanation. Instead, the story claims he hinted at something far more dangerous. That he wasn't alone. Now pause for a second and think about this. When someone is accused of an unforgivable act, there are two instincts. One is denial. The other is deflection. And deflection is where lists are born. A list doesn't just say, I didn't do this. A list says, I wasn't the only one who knew. I wasn't the only one who stood there. I wasn't the only one who benefited. In this fictional retelling, whispers begin circulating almost immediately, not through official channels, not through courtroom testimony, but through conversations that feel too specific to be invented and too vague to be proven. A list exists. Names exist. And if they're true, even hypothetically, they change everything. But here's the twist that makes this story worth telling. The names on the list aren't random. They aren't faceless accomplices. They aren't shadowy figures no one's heard of. They are people tied by blood, by loyalty, by proximity, and by power. And that's why this story matters now. Because we live in an era where narratives move faster than facts, where belief often arrives before evidence, where audiences are trained to pick sides before understanding the stakes. So tonight, instead of asking, is this true? Which this fictional narrative never claims to be, we ask something more revealing. Why do we believe stories like this so easily? Why do lists feel convincing even when they're unverified? And why does the idea of hidden accomplices ignite something primal inside us? In this dramatized account, the list supposedly surfaces during a moment of pressure. A moment when the son realizes that silence no longer protects him. A moment when isolation becomes unbearable. And here's where things turn emotional. Because the names on the list, as the story claims, aren't just about guilt. They're about betrayal. Family betrayal. Friendship betrayal. The kind of betrayal that doesn't need blood to feel violent. Imagine realizing that the people who shaped your world, the people who influenced your choices, the people who stood close enough to intervene, didn't. That's the emotional engine driving this story. And it's why this fictional narrative doesn't rush to accuse, it dissects motive. In this retelling, the son isn't portrayed as a mastermind. He's portrayed as a pressure point. A fracture where years of unresolved tension finally collapse inward. So ask yourself this as we move forward. If a list like this existed, real or imagined, would it be an act of truth? Or an act of revenge? Would it be a confession? Or a weapon? Because once a name is spoken aloud, it can never be unheard. And in this story, the first name allegedly whispered doesn't shock because of who it implicates. It shocks because of how close it is to home. A sibling. Someone who shared history, not headlines. Someone who understands the family dynamic better than any investigator ever could. And that raises a terrifying question. What if the real danger in this story isn't the crime, but the quiet agreements that came before it? The unspoken rules, the decisions not to intervene, the moments where everyone assumed someone else would act. This fictional expose leans into that discomfort, because true crime storytelling isn't really about crime. It's about proximity. Who was close enough to know, close enough to stop it, close enough to walk away. And according to this dramatized narrative, the list doesn't emerge all at once. It unfolds, name by name, each one heavier than the last. Some names feel obvious, others feel unthinkable, and one name, the one teased but not yet revealed, threatens to collapse the entire story under its own weight, because it forces a final question we don't like asking. What if guilt isn't always about action, but about omission? What if being an accomplice doesn't require holding a weapon, only holding your tongue? This introduction isn't here to tell you what to believe. It's here to prepare you for what's coming. We start with the night, everything fractured, the silence, the discovery, and the first moment when someone realized this story would never stay contained. And once you hear how that night unfolded in this fictional reconstruction, you'll understand why the list, real or imagined, was inevitable. Because what came next didn't just change the investigation. It changed the meaning of loyalty itself. What really happens in the first hour after everything falls apart? Not the press conferences, not the rumors, not the online theories. I'm talking about the moment before any of that exists. The moment when the truth hasn't been shaped yet. The moment when silence still has power. Because in this fictional reconstruction, the night didn't begin with chaos. It began with quiet. A kind of quiet that only exists in large homes. Too large for comfort. Too large for connection. A quiet where footsteps echo longer than they should, and doors feel heavier every time they close. In this story, the house wasn't loud. There were no alarms. No screaming neighbors. No cinematic panic. Just stillness. And here's the detail most people miss when they imagine moments like this. Stillness isn't peaceful. It's suffocating. Especially when everyone inside the house knows something is wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Picture the layout. Separate wings, long hallways, private spaces designed for privacy, not protection. A home built to keep people apart, even when they live under the same roof. And in this fictional timeline, that design choice mattered. Because when tragedy struck, it didn't announce itself. It waited. Minutes passed. Then longer stretches of time where nothing moved. And somewhere in that silence, a line was crossed, not just physically, but emotionally. Now let me ask you something. If you sensed something was wrong in your own home, would you investigate immediately? Or would you hesitate? Most people hesitate, because hesitation is safer than confirmation. In this story, the discovery doesn't happen right away. It happens after uncertainty has already had time to grow teeth. Someone notices a door that shouldn't be closed. Someone notices a light still on. Someone notices the kind of absence that feels louder than presence. And that's when fear stops being abstract. That's when it becomes personal. According to this fictional narrative, the first reaction isn't screaming. It's disbelief. No one wants to believe what their eyes are trying to tell them. Because belief would mean the family, the image, the history, the legacy, is already broken. So they delay. Seconds feel like minutes. Minutes feel like hours. And then someone steps forward. Someone always does. The discovery itself is not where the story turns. It's what happens immediately afterward. Because in this dramatized account, the people inside the house don't react the same way. One person freezes. Another person panics. Another person goes eerily calm. And calmness, in moments like this, is often misunderstood. Calmness looks like control, but sometimes it's shock wearing a mask. Now think about this carefully. When something horrific happens inside a family, everyone present becomes a witness, whether they want to be or not. Not just a witness to the event, but to each other. Who moves first? Who avoids eye contact? Who asks questions? Who doesn't? In this story, those details linger. Because later, much later, people will replay this night in their heads and realize the warning signs weren't hidden. They were ignored. And here's where the son enters the scene. Not dramatically, not with a confession or a breakdown. He enters quietly, too quietly. In this fictional version, he doesn't rush in demanding answers. He doesn't collapse. He doesn't scream. He stands, watching, processing. And if that sounds chilling, it should. Because investigators often say the most revealing reactions aren't the loud ones, they're the controlled ones. Now, before you jump to conclusions, ask yourself this. Does calmness equal guilt? Or does it equal emotional overload? That's the contradiction this story sits inside. Because in the immediate aftermath, no one knows what to think. Not the family, not the authorities, not even the son himself. Shock doesn't arrive with instructions. And in this fictional retelling, the first conversations are chaotic and incomplete. Sentences trail off. Questions overlap. No one finishes a thought. But one thing is clear. This night will not stay private. Because the moment authorities are contacted, the moment outsiders enter the home, the story stops belonging to the family. It becomes public property. And that's when fear evolves. Fear stops being about loss and starts being about exposure. In the dramatized narrative, law enforcement arrives to a scene that doesn't scream guilt, it whispers complexity. There are no immediate answers, no obvious explanation that ties everything together neatly. And that's dangerous, because when there's no clear story, people create one. Especially the media, especially the public. But even before the headlines appear, something subtle happens inside the house. A shift. The son realizes something, not about the crime, but about perception. He realizes that no matter what he says next, the story will shape itself around him. Because proximity is powerful. Living nearby makes you visible. Visibility makes you suspect. And suspicion doesn't need proof to spread. In this fictional account, the son understands that silence will not save him, but speaking too soon could destroy him. So he does what many people do in moments of extreme pressure. He retreats inward. And that retreat is later interpreted as detachment. Now pause here. How many times have we mistaken shock for indifference? How often have we labeled silence as guilt simply because it makes us uncomfortable? That's one of the unsettling truths this story explores. Because from the outside, reactions look suspicious. From the inside, they feel paralyzing. As the night progresses, family members are separated, physically and emotionally. Different rooms, different conversations, different interpretations of what just happened. And that fragmentation matters. Because when people stop sharing a single narrative, multiple truths begin to compete. In this dramatized retelling, one sibling begins asking questions immediately, not out of accusation, out of panic. Questions like, how did this happen? Who was last seen? Who knew what? Another sibling avoids questions altogether. Avoidance doesn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it means fear of what the answers might reveal. And the son? He listens. He absorbs. He remembers who says what. And later, when this story spirals, those memories become fuel. Now here's a detail that becomes crucial later in the narrative. According to this fictional version, someone mentions something small. So small it almost doesn't register. A disagreement earlier that week. A tension that never fully resolved. A comment made in passing. At the time, it feels irrelevant. Later, it becomes everything. Because true crime stories don't pivot on big moments. They pivot on overlooked ones. And this night is filled with them. The way someone avoids a room. The way someone insists on repeating a detail. The way someone insists on leaving. As dawn approaches, exhaustion sets in. Not the kind that leads to sleep, the kind that dulls judgment. And it's in that state, according to the dramatized narrative, that the first internal line is drawn. An unspoken one. Us than him. Not formally. Not deliberately. But emotionally. And that's when isolation begins. The son notices it before anyone else does. The slight change in tone. The guarded looks. The absence of reassurance. He feels the story turning against him before it ever hits the news. And here's the uncomfortable part. He might be right. Because in families, grief doesn't always unite. Sometimes it reveals fault lines that were always there. Resentments resurface. Old arguments gain new meaning. And in this fictional account, the son realizes something else as the night ends. That whatever happened didn't begin tonight. Tonight was just the rupture. The breaking point of something much older. And that realization is what eventually leads him to the list. Not immediately. Not impulsively. But inevitably. Because when you believe the story being told about you is incomplete, you start thinking about what's missing, who's missing, and who benefited from staying silent. As the sun rises, the house looks different. Not because anything has changed, but because perception has. It no longer feels like a home. It feels like a crime scene. And crime scenes don't belong to families. They belong to narratives. A dangerous one, if everyone is watching him. Maybe it's time to show them where else to look. Because the night everything fractured didn't just destroy a family. It planted the seed of a story that would soon spiral far beyond that house. And once that seed took root, nothing would be contained again. What happens when the story decides who you are before you ever get to speak? Because that's the moment this chapter lives in. Not after the charges, not after the headlines harden, but right in the middle of the uncertainty. When everyone is still pretending they're waiting for facts, while already choosing sides. The night has ended, morning has arrived, but clarity hasn't. And in this fictional reconstruction, the son wakes up to a reality that feels unreal. Not because of where he is, but because of how people are looking at him. You know that look, the one that isn't openly hostile, but isn't neutral either. It's cautious, measured, as if every word you say might later be replayed in someone else's mind. That's the look he notices first. Family members aren't shouting accusations. They aren't demanding explanations. They're watching. And being watched is often worse than being confronted. Because confrontation gives you something to respond to. Observation turns you into an object. In this dramatized narrative, the son feels the shift almost immediately. He's no longer just grieving. He's being evaluated. Every movement feels visible. Every pause feels suspicious. Even silence becomes loud. And here's the contradiction that starts pulling him apart. He knows he should say something, but he doesn't know what version of himself the room is willing to hear. Because when tragedy hits, people don't just want the truth. They want a story that makes sense. And the simplest story is often the most dangerous. The son lives close by. The son was present. The son is complicated. That's enough for a narrative to form. Ask yourself this. If you were in his place, would you trust the room? Or would you start guarding yourself against it? In this fictional account, the son chooses caution. Not because he's calculating, but because he's overwhelmed. Shock doesn't clarify thoughts. It fractures them. And in that fractured state, every decision feels permanent. Say too much, and you risk misinterpretation. Say too little, and you invite speculation. There's no safe option. As the hours pass, the circle around him tightens, not physically, but emotionally. People start asking indirect questions. How long were you awake last night? Did you hear anything unusual? When was the last time you spoke to them? Normal questions. Reasonable questions. But when you're already feeling watched, they don't feel neutral. They feel loaded. And this is where the story deepens. Because in this fictional retelling, the son isn't just reacting to the present moment. He's reacting to years of unresolved tension. Family dynamics don't appear overnight. They accumulate. Old arguments. Unspoken resentments. Roles that never change. The responsible one. The volatile one. The distant one. Once those labels exist, they don't disappear when tragedy strikes. They become evidence. And the son knows which label has followed him longest. Not violent. Not cruel. But unpredictable. Unpredictability is a dangerous reputation. Because when something unthinkable happens, people don't ask, who did this? They ask, who could do this? And that subtle shift changes everything. In this dramatized narrative, the son becomes acutely aware of how the story might unfold without him. How others might fill in the blanks. How silence can be interpreted as strategy rather than shock. And this awareness doesn't make him defensive. It makes him afraid. Afraid that the truth, whatever it is, will be buried under assumptions. Now here's where the emotional contradiction intensifies. The son doesn't feel anger first. He feels betrayal. Not because anyone has accused him outright, but because he senses how quickly trust can evaporate when fear enters the room. And fear is everywhere now. Fear of the media. Fear of legal consequences. Fear of being associated with something unforgivable. Everyone wants distance. Distance from the crime. Distance from the questions. Distance from him. And isolation doesn't need bars to feel like a cage. In this fictional reconstruction, there's a moment, small but significant, that the son never forgets. A family member avoids sitting next to him. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a slight shift of the chair. But to him, it feels seismic. Because it confirms what he's already begun to suspect. The story is no longer shared. It's fractured. And when stories fracture, people start protecting themselves. That's when the son begins replaying recent conversations in his mind. Not from last night. From weeks. The resolve not to be the only one holding the weight of a story that involves more than one person. Because in his mind, rightly or wrongly, this didn't begin with him. It began long before. With dynamics everyone tolerated. With tensions everyone ignored. With moments everyone chose not to confront. And that's when the list stops being hypothetical. It becomes a possibility, a way to redirect the narrative. Not toward violence, but toward accountability. Now let me be clear. In this fictional account, the list is not written yet. No names are finalized. No accusations are made. But the idea has crossed a line. Once you start thinking in terms of shared responsibility, you can't unthink it. And that thought terrifies him. Because it means the story won't just be about him anymore. It will be about everyone he names. Family, friends, people with influence. And influence changes everything. Because influence doesn't just shape outcomes. It shapes perception. As the chapter closes, the son is left with an impossible choice. Remain silent, and allow the narrative to collapse inward around him. Or speak, and risk detonating something far larger than himself. And in the quiet that follows, one final realization takes hold. If he's going to be judged anyway, he might as well tell the story the way he sees it. Because the storm is already forming. And at the center of it is a list that could rewrite every assumption people think they've already made. What happens when a thought becomes a whisper, and a whisper becomes a threat? Because that's how it begins in this story. Not with a document. Not with a press leak. Not with a dramatic reveal. It begins with a sentence that never fully finishes. The son doesn't announce it. He doesn't even admit it to himself out loud. He simply asks a question that feels dangerous the moment it leaves his mind. Who else knew? That question doesn't accuse. It interrogates memory. And memory, once stirred, doesn't stay quiet. In this fictional reconstruction, the son sits alone for long stretches of time. Not hiding, not plotting, replaying. Conversations from months ago take on a sharper edge. Jokes that felt harmless now sound dismissive. Warnings that were brushed aside now feel heavy. And that's the thing about hindsight. It doesn't invent new facts. It reorders the old ones. The whispered list isn't born out of malice. It's born out of frustration. Frustration with being seen as the sole axis of a catastrophe that, in his mind, involved more than one turning point. And here's the uncomfortable truth this chapter sits with. People don't create lists to lie. They create lists to simplify chaos. A list makes the unmanageable feel structured. It gives shape to something overwhelming. And in moments of emotional overload, structure feels like control. So the son begins, cautiously, internally, name by name. Not written, not recorded. Just acknowledged. Who was close enough to see the cracks forming? Who had influence over decisions that mattered? Who benefited from things staying exactly as they were? These aren't criminal questions. They're moral ones. And moral questions are far more destabilizing. Because they don't end with yes or no. They end with discomfort. Now pause here. Have you ever noticed how quickly people distance themselves from questions that make them uneasy? That's not coincidence. Questions expose responsibility in ways answers never do. In this dramatized narrative, the son starts testing the edges of the idea. He doesn't share it openly. He floats fragments, carefully worded sentences, vague observations, nothing explicit. But the reaction is immediate. Some people stiffen. Some change the subject. Some reassure him too quickly. And reassurance, when unprompted, can be revealing. Because why reassure someone who hasn't accused you? That contradiction doesn't go unnoticed. The whispered list begins to take form not through accusation, but through reaction. Who bristles? Who deflects? Who insists everything is simple? Simplicity is comforting. But in complex tragedies, it's often dishonest. As days pass in this fictional timeline, the atmosphere thickens. The media has started circling. Questions are becoming sharper. And the son feels pressure from two directions. Outside voices demanding answers. Inside voices demanding silence. And that's when the whisper changes tone. It becomes transactional. Not who else knew, but who wants this to go away? That's a darker question. Because wanting something to disappear doesn't mean you caused it. But it does mean you fear what exposure might reveal. In this dramatized retelling, the son notices a shift in conversations. People begin talking about optics, about narratives, about protecting reputations. The word truth is used less frequently. Instead, phrases like best outcome, and damage control start appearing. And that alarms him. Because when reputation becomes the priority, truth becomes negotiable. This is where the whispered list gains weight. Because it's no longer about past moments. It's about present behavior. Who is guiding the response? Who is advising restraint? Who is framing what should and shouldn't be said? Influence reveals itself most clearly during crisis. And influence, in this story, isn't evenly distributed. Some voices carry more authority. Some opinions shut down discussion. And the son begins to realize something unsettling. The people urging silence aren't the ones with the most to lose emotionally. They're the ones with the most to lose publicly. That distinction matters. Because public loss threatens status. Private loss threatens identity. And those two fears don't behave the same way. In this fictional reconstruction, the son feels caught between them. He has lost something personal and irreversible. Others fear losing something abstract but powerful. And that imbalance fuels resentment. The whispered list starts to feel less like an idea and more like leverage. Now, before you recoil at that word, consider this. Leverage doesn't require malice. Sometimes it's just a way to be heard. When you feel invisible inside your own story, leverage becomes tempting. Because leverage forces attention. And attention, in moments like this, feels like survival. The son doesn't announce the list. He alludes to it. Subtly. A comment here. A pause there. Enough to signal that he isn't carrying the weight alone. And the effect is immediate. People begin asking him what he means. Not openly. Not in groups. Privately. One-on-one conversations take on a different tone. Concerned. Careful. And careful conversations reveal fear. Fear of being named. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of association. And that fear feeds the whisper. Because fear confirms relevance. If the list were meaningless, no one would react. But reactions pour gasoline on the idea. Now let's talk about the psychology at play. When someone feels cornered, they look for exits. But when exits are blocked, they look for mirrors. They want others to see what they see. And in this dramatized narrative, the son isn't trying to deflect guilt. He's trying to distribute responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Moral responsibility. And that's a dangerous distinction. Because moral responsibility doesn't require proof. It requires narrative. And narratives are shaped by perception. As days turn into weeks, the whispered list becomes a shadow. It follows conversations. It lingers in pauses. No one asks for it directly, but everyone wonders if they're on it. And wondering is corrosive, because it changes behavior. People become more guarded, more strategic. Words are chosen with care. And the son notices something else. The more people try to manage the narrative, the more fragmented it becomes. Different versions circulate, different emphases, different omissions. And those inconsistencies don't go unnoticed. They're cataloged. Because once you start listing, you don't stop at names. You list contradictions. You list evasions. You list who says one thing privately and another publicly. And the whispered list grows. Not in length, but in implication. Now let me ask you something. If someone you trusted hinted they could expose uncomfortable truths, would you listen more closely? Or would you try to shut them down? In this story, people choose different approaches. Some attempt reassurance. Some attempt control. Some attempt distance. And distance is the most revealing of all. Because distance suggests fear of proximity. Fear of being linked. Fear of appearing complicit. Even in silence, the son begins to understand the power of the whisper. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to exist. Because the mere possibility of a list forces people to confront their own actions. And that confrontation is uncomfortable, especially when actions weren't malicious, just convenient. Convenience is easy to justify in the moment, harder to defend in hindsight. And this is where the story sharpens. Because the whispered list isn't about villains. It's about enablers. People who didn't cause harm, but didn't stop it either. People who assumed someone else would intervene. People who chose peace over confrontation. Those choices feel reasonable at the time. But after tragedy, they feel damning. In this dramatized narrative, the son struggles with this realization. Because listing names doesn't bring relief. It brings grief. Grief for relationships that were never what he thought they were. Grief for trust that evaporated under pressure. And yet, he can't let go of the idea. Because the idea has power. And power, once tasted, is hard to relinquish. As this chapter draws toward its end, the the whispered list reaches a turning point. It stops being internal, not publicly, but relationally. Someone confronts him, not angrily, not accusingly, fearfully. They ask him what he's planning to do. That question lands like a confession, because it assumes intent, and intent implies capability. The son doesn't answer directly. He doesn't need to. The silence does the work for him. And in that silence, something irreversible happens. The whisper becomes expectation. People now believe the list exists, whether it does or not. And belief is more powerful than proof, because belief changes behavior before evidence ever appears. As the chapter closes, the son understands the gravity of what he's set in motion. He can no longer pretend this is just a thought experiment. Others are reacting, adjusting, protecting themselves. And once self-protection enters the room, truth becomes negotiable. Which leads us to the next, more dangerous phase of this story. Because whispers don't stay whispers forever. Eventually, someone speaks too loudly. And when that happens, the list won't just suggest shared responsibility. It will force people to choose sides. What happens when the people who know you best begin to look at you like a liability? Because that's where this chapter opens. Not with accusations shouted across a room. Not with slammed doors or dramatic confrontations. But with distance. Subtle, measured, intentional. The kind of distance that doesn't announce itself, but rearranges the air. In this fictional reconstruction, the whispered list has done something dangerous. It has introduced suspicion into relationships that once survived on assumption. Family relationships are built on shortcuts. We assume loyalty. We assume protection. We assume silence. And when those assumptions are shaken, everything feels unstable. The son feels it immediately. Phone calls become shorter. Text messages are more formal. Plans dissolve without explanation. No one says, "We don't trust you." They don't need to. Distance says it for them. And here's the contradiction that makes this chapter uncomfortable. The people pulling away aren't doing it out of cruelty. They're doing it out of fear. Fear of being implicated. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being associated with a narrative they can't control. Fear doesn't always look like hostility. Sometimes it looks like politeness. In this dramatized account, family gatherings become tense without anyone raising their voice. Conversations stick to safe topics. Eye contact is brief. Silences linger longer than they should. And the son begins to understand something that cuts deeper than accusation. He is no longer being treated as family. He is being treated as risk. And that shift fractures loyalty in ways that are difficult to repair. Because loyalty isn't tested when things are easy. It's tested when proximity carries consequences. Now think about your own family for a moment. How many things go unspoken because speaking them would create conflict? How many concerns are swallowed because peace feels more valuable than truth? In this fictional narrative, those unspoken patterns come roaring back into relevance. Old dynamics resurface. The sibling who always avoided conflict continues to do so, only now, avoidance feels strategic. The sibling who always tried to mediate suddenly goes quiet, overwhelmed by the weight of choosing sides. And the son watches these patterns with new eyes. Because patterns don't just explain behavior, they predict it. And prediction is power. The whispered list has made everyone hyper-aware of their roles. Who is seen as supportive? Who is seen as distant? Who is seen as controlling? And once roles become visible, they become negotiable. That's where fractures form. In this dramatized retelling, one sibling begins asserting a version of events early. Not aggressively, not dishonestly, just confidently. Confidence can sound like truth when no one else wants to argue. They speak in absolutes. This happened. That didn't. There's nothing more to discuss. And absolutes are comforting. But comfort isn't the same as accuracy. The son notices how quickly this version gains traction. How others repeat it without questioning. And repetition creates consensus. Consensus creates authority. Authority creates silence. That chain reaction alarms him. Because once a family settles on a single narrative, dissent becomes betrayal. And the whispered list is the ultimate form of dissent. It threatens the comfort of certainty. In this fictional reconstruction, the son finds himself torn between two impulses. Protect the family image. Or protect the complexity of the truth as he sees it. Those goals are no longer aligned. Because family image depends on simplicity. Truth rarely is. As days pass, the fractures widen. Private conversations contradict public statements. What's said behind closed doors doesn't match what's said to outsiders. And the son begins noticing how quickly loyalty becomes conditional. Conditional on silence. Conditional on compliance. Conditional on not disrupting the agreed-upon version of events. That's when betrayal stops being hypothetical. It becomes experiential. Not a single act, but a series of small decisions. Decisions to withhold support. Decisions to avoid advocacy. Decisions to let assumptions stand unchallenged. None of these decisions feel cruel in isolation. Together, they form abandonment. And abandonment hurts more when it comes from family. In this dramatized narrative, the son doesn't confront anyone directly. He doesn't accuse. Instead, he asks questions. Gentle ones. Clarifying ones. Questions like, do you really believe that? Or, why are we saying it that way? And those questions are met with discomfort. Because questions disrupt alignment. Alignment feels safer than truth when fear is in control. The family begins splitting into informal camps. Not announced. Not deliberate. Just noticeable. Those who believe the narrative must remain simple. Those who believe silence is the safest option. And the son, isolated between them, feels increasingly alone. This is where the emotional stakes deepen. Because isolation changes motivation. When you feel supported, you protect the group. When you feel abandoned, you protect yourself. That's not selfishness. It's survival. The whispered list starts to feel less like leverage and more like insurance. Insurance against being scapegoated. Insurance against being erased from the story. Insurance against being remembered as the sole cause of something far more complicated. Now let's talk about loyalty. Loyalty isn't just about standing by someone publicly. It's about challenging them privately. And in this fictional account, the son realizes something devastating. No one is challenging anyone anymore. Everyone is protecting their own position. And that means the truth, whatever it is being sacrificed for stability. Stability built on omission. That realization hardens something inside him. Not into anger, into clarity. Because clarity reveals uncomfortable truths. Like the fact that some family members are more concerned with external perception than internal accountability. That some are willing to let the son absorb suspicion if it keeps their own reputations intact. And reputation is a powerful motivator, especially in families accustomed to public attention. The son begins to see how quickly people pivot from grief to management. Managing optics, managing conversations, managing expectations. And management requires control. Which brings us to the most unsettling shift in this chapter. Someone begins telling the son what not to say. Not advice. Not guidance. Instruction. Avoid this topic. Don't mention that. Let the lawyers handle it. On the surface, it sounds practical. But beneath it lies something more troubling. Control over narrative. And control over narrative is a form of power. The son feels it immediately. Because control isn't offered, it's asserted. And once someone asserts control, they reveal what they fear losing. In this dramatized narrative, that fear isn't about justice. It's about exposure. Exposure of past decisions. Exposure of inaction. Exposure of dynamics that look harmless until tragedy reframes them. And suddenly, the whispered list feels dangerous in a new way. Not because of what it might accuse, but because of what it might reveal. The family begins to fracture along lines of perceived threat. Who could be implicated by proximity? Who could be questioned by association? These aren't legal calculations. They're social ones. And social consequences can be just as devastating. The son senses the walls closing in. Not from the outside, from within. And that's when loyalty breaks. Not dramatically, quietly. A family member refuses to back him publicly. Another declines to correct a misleading assumption. Another stops returning messages altogether. Each instance feels small. Together, they feel final. And in that accumulation of silence, the son makes a crucial decision. If loyalty is conditional, then truth will be conditional too. He will no longer protect people who won't protect him. Not by lying, but by refusing to carry their silence alone. That decision doesn't bring relief. It brings resolve. Because resolve is heavy. It means accepting consequences. And the consequence here is clear. The whispered list will not remain a whisper forever. But before it becomes audible, one more fracture needs to occur. A personal one. Because family fractures aren't just about disagreement. They're about identity. who you are allowed to be inside the family narrative. And in this fictional reconstruction, the son realizes his role has been rewritten. He's no longer the complicated one. He's the convenient one. Convenient to isolate. Convenient. The family fractures from the inside, but the pressure from the outside is building now. Media speculation, online chatter, private conversations that leak into public narratives. The story is no longer just about what happened. It's about who's involved. And involvement doesn't require action. It requires visibility. In this dramatized narrative, the son notices how quickly certain names change the temperature of a room. Say one name, and people lean in. Say another, and they pull back. Names carry gravity, not because of guilt, but because of what they represent. Influence, status, access. And access is where this story turns darker. Because once influence enters the equation, truth becomes negotiable. The son begins seeing it everywhere. A lawyer who speaks differently when certain people are mentioned. A family advisor who suddenly urges caution instead of clarity. Friends who avoid saying anything specific at all. Silence spreads faster when powerful names are nearby. Because powerful names invite powerful consequences. Now ask yourself this. If you were connected, even indirectly, to someone whose reputation could be damaged by proximity to scandal, would you speak freely? Or would you start managing your words? In this fictional account, people choose management. And management leaves fingerprints. The son notices how conversations shift when certain associations are implied. Tone softens. Language becomes vague. Responsibility blurs. No one says, let's lie. They say, let's be careful. Carefulness sounds responsible, but it often hides fear. Fear of guilt by association. Fear that being named, even hypothetically, could undo years of credibility. And that fear creates a hierarchy. Some names are protected. Some are expendable. The son begins to see where he falls. Not because he's guilty, but because he's convenient. He doesn't have the same insulation. He doesn't have the same public buffer. And in a narrative driven by optics, insulation matters more than innocence. This is where the power of association becomes a weapon, not wielded openly, but felt everywhere. People start framing conversations around how this looks. They talk about the danger of speculation. They caution against feeding narratives. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Until you realize what's missing. No one talks about clarity. No one talks about accountability. They talk about containment. Containment of damage. Containment of attention. Containment of fallout. And containment requires sacrifice. In this fictional retelling, the son begins to suspect who that sacrifice is meant to be. Him. Because he's already in the spotlight. Already questioned. Already scrutinized. And when you're already under suspicion, adding weight doesn't change the balance. It just makes the burden unbearable. So the son watches as association quietly reshapes the narrative. Some people's names are never mentioned. Others are mentioned cautiously, then quickly dismissed. But his name? His name is everywhere. It's attached to every version of the story, even versions that contradict each other. That's when the list, the whispered one, takes on new meaning. Because now it isn't just about shared responsibility. It's about shared influence. Who can redirect attention? Who can calm speculation? Who can make things disappear? And that's a dangerous realization. Because it suggests that truth isn't just about what happened. It's about who has the power to frame what happened. The son starts asking different questions now. Not who knew, but who controls. Control over lawyers. Control over messaging. Control over access. He begins noticing patterns. Certain people are shielded from direct questioning. Others are subtly steered away from the spotlight. And none of this is coordinated openly. That's the genius of power. It doesn't need a meeting. It needs alignment. And alignment happens when interests overlap. In this fictional narrative, interests overlap around one shared goal. Make this go away. Make it manageable. Make it stop spreading. And the son understands the cost of that goal. Someone must absorb the pressure. Someone must remain the center. Someone must be the explanation. And association determines who that someone is. He notices how often people say, "We don't want to drag others into this." It sounds compassionate. But what it really means is, some people are too important to name. That realization lands hard. Because importance shouldn't determine truth. But in this story, it does. The son feels anger flicker for the first time. Not explosive. Controlled. Anger at the imbalance. Anger at the way power rewrites morality. Because if association can protect some people, then it can implicate others just as easily. And that's when the list sharpens. The Sun doesn't think of it as a threat. He thinks of it as a counterweight. If association is being used to shield, then association can also reveal. Not crimes, not actions, but relationships, influence networks, moments where power intersected with silence. And that's the core of this chapter. Because association isn't about guilt. It's about proximity to decisions. Who was close enough to shape outcomes? Who was influential enough to redirect attention? Those questions don't accuse. They expose structure. And structures don't like being exposed. In this dramatized account, the Sun tests this theory quietly. He mentions a name casually, not accusingly, just in conversation. And the reaction is immediate. Tension spikes. Someone changes the subject. Someone else steps in to smooth things over. That reaction confirms everything. Because innocent associations don't need defending, but powerful ones do. The Sun realizes he's stumbled onto something bigger than family. He's uncovered a web. Not criminal, political, social, reputational. And webs are fragile. Pull one thread, and the entire structure vibrates. Now think about how often powerful people avoid scandal. Not by being innocent, but by being untouchable. Untouchable through influence, through relationships, through carefully cultivated distance. In this fictional narrative, the Sun sees that distance in real time. Some people become unreachable. Some conversations are redirected through intermediaries. The message is subtle but clear. You don't get to speak to them directly. That barrier isn't just physical. It's symbolic. It says, this conversation is above your station. And that infuriates him, because it reinforces the hierarchy. Some names matter more than others. Some reputations are protected at all costs. And if costs must be paid, they will be paid by those with the least protection. This is where the emotional stakes deepen. Because the Sun doesn't want revenge. He wants balance. He wants the narrative to reflect reality. Messy, complicated, shared. But power doesn't like mess. Power likes simplicity. And simplicity demands a single villain. The Sun realizes he's being groomed for that role. Not overtly. Not maliciously. Just conveniently. And convenience is ruthless. Because it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like inevitability. That's when he understands the true danger of association. It doesn't just shape perception. It shapes outcomes. Who gets questioned? Who gets protected? Who gets forgotten? And the list, the one that started as a whisper, now feels necessary. Not to accuse, but to complicate. To disrupt the simplicity power depends on. Because once complexity enters the room, control weakens. And control is what everyone is clinging to now. As this chapter approaches its end, the Sun stands at a crossroads. He can continue absorbing the weight of association, or he can redistribute it. Not recklessly, not publicly, but deliberately. By acknowledging connections that others hope will remain invisible. Because invisibility is power's greatest ally. And the moment something becomes visible, it becomes vulnerable. That realization solidifies his resolve. The list will not be about scandal. It will be about structure. About who stands where. Who influences whom. Who benefits from silence. And once those relationships are exposed, even hypothetically, the narrative will change. Because the story will no longer be about one person. It will be about a system. And systems don't like scrutiny. As this chapter closes, the Sun understands something chilling. Once association becomes the battlefield, no one is truly safe. Not him. Not his family. Not the people whose names carry weight. Because association cuts both ways. And the next phase of this story doesn't just question who is involved. It questions how influence shapes truth itself. And when that question is asked out loud, someone will panic. What happens when the story moves faster than the facts? Because that's the moment everything tilts. Not when evidence is found. Not when charges are filed. But when the narrative escapes containment and starts living a life of its own. In this fictional reconstruction, the shift is subtle at first. A headline here. A comment there. A theory framed as a question. Nothing definitive. Nothing provable. But momentum doesn't need proof. It needs repetition. And repetition turns speculation into expectation. The Sun feels it before he sees it. That pressure in the air. That sense that people aren't listening anymore. They're waiting. Waiting for confirmation of what they've already decided. Because once a story outruns evidence, facts stop leading. They chase. In this dramatized narrative, conversations begin to feel rehearsed. People ask the same questions. They use the same phrases. They reference the same assumptions. Not because they coordinated, because they absorbed. And absorption is how narratives spread. The sun notices how quickly nuance disappears. How quickly we don't know yet becomes it seems likely. And it seems likely becomes everyone knows. Now pause here. Have you ever watched a rumor evolve? It doesn't grow by adding details. It grows by removing doubt. Doubt slows things down. Certainty speeds them up. And certainty is intoxicating, especially when fear and curiosity collide. In this fictional account, online speculation intensifies. Anonymous posts, confident threads, side-by-side photos implying connections. None of it is evidence. All of it feels convincing, because it tells a simple story, and simplicity travels well. The sun watches as fragments of his life are pulled out of context. Old photos reframed, past comments reinterpreted, neutral facts given sinister meaning. And here's the contradiction that fuels his frustration. If he stays silent, people assume guilt. If he speaks, people assume strategy. There is no neutral posture once the story takes over. Because the story isn't waiting for him. It's feeding on itself. In this dramatized narrative, he tries to correct one small detail publicly. Just one. A factual clarification. And the reaction is immediate. It's ignored. Or worse, twisted. Because when a story outruns evidence, corrections feel like interruptions. People don't want to be interrupted. They want resolution. They want closure. And closure doesn't require accuracy. It requires a satisfying ending. The sun realizes something chilling. The narrative doesn't need him anymore. It has grown beyond its source. That's when fear changes shape. It's no longer fear of accusation. It's fear of irrelevance. Fear that even if the truth exists, it won't matter. Because stories that outrun evidence don't slow down for reality. They only slow down for drama. And drama demands escalation. In this fictional reconstruction, new claims begin surfacing. Not from authorities. Not from credible sources. From interpretation. People start connecting dots that were never meant to connect. They infer motives. They invent timelines. And each invention reinforces the next. This is where the whispered list becomes dangerous in a new way. Because now, even the idea of a list feeds the story. People speculate about what's on it. Who's on it? Why it hasn't been released. The absence of information becomes information. And absence is fertile ground. The sun realizes that even silence is now interpreted as confirmation. Silence means he's hiding something. Hesitation means calculation. Emotion means guilt. Everything fits, because the story has decided what it wants to say. Now let's talk about the audience inside the story. Not viewers like you, but the people surrounding him. Family, advisors, friends. They feel the shift too. Conversations change. People stop asking what's true. They ask what's believable. Believability becomes the metric, and believability favors drama over complexity. Because complexity demands patience. Drama demands reaction. In this fictional account, some people begin urging him to let the story play out. Stories burn themselves out, they say, but stories don't burn out. They harden. They crystallize. They become reference points. And once they crystallize, they're nearly impossible to shatter. That realization brings desperation. Not loud desperation. Quiet. Focused. The sun starts documenting everything. Conversations. Timelines. Contradictions. Not because he thinks it will stop the story, but because he refuses to be erased by it. This is where the emotional core of the chapter tightens. The sun isn't fighting accusations. He's fighting inevitability. The sense that no matter what he does, the ending has already been written. And inevitability is suffocating. Because it robs you of agency. The whispered list becomes a counter-narrative. Not as a reveal, but as a reminder. A reminder that stories are constructed, not discovered. And if a story is being constructed around him, then he can question its architecture. Who built it? Who benefits from it? Who reinforces it? Those questions don't accuse individuals. They challenge momentum. And momentum hates being challenged. In this dramatized narrative, the sun sees how certain versions of the story get amplified. Not the cautious ones. Not the balanced ones. The bold ones. the versions that name villains and imply conspiracies. Because boldness cuts through noise, and noise is what everyone is chasing. The son realizes something deeply unsettling. He is no longer a person in this story. He's a symbol, a placeholder for fear, outrage, and curiosity. And symbols don't get fairness. They get used. That realization pushes him toward a line he didn't want to cross. Because if the story insists on turning him into a symbol, then maybe it's time to expose the system that creates symbols in the first place. This is where the whispered list transforms again. It stops being about names. It becomes about timing. When to speak. When to disrupt. Because speaking too early feeds speculation. Speaking too late confirms it. The window is narrow, and narrowing by the hour. In this fictional reconstruction, pressure comes from all sides. Some urge him to release something, anything, to reclaim the narrative. Others urge him to wait, trusting that facts will prevail. But facts don't prevail automatically. They need space, and space has been consumed. The son feels like he's shouting underwater. Every movement is slow. Every sound is distorted. And above him, the story rages on, untouched. This is where panic sets in. Not the kind that causes breakdowns. The kind that sharpens focus. Because panic, when contained, becomes strategy. The son begins thinking differently. Not about proving innocence, but about reframing the conversation. If stories outrun evidence, then evidence needs allies. Context, complexity, contradiction. And contradiction is the enemy of certainty. That's when the idea of exposure returns. Not exposure of crimes. Exposure of process. How stories form. How power shapes them. How silence is rewarded. The whispered list could serve that purpose. Not as a document, but as a concept. A reminder that the narrative isn't singular. That there are other perspectives, other influences, other omissions. This isn't about shifting blame. It's about expanding the frame. And expansion terrifies people who rely on simplicity. In this dramatized narrative, the son senses the shift again. People around him grow more anxious. Not because of new evidence, because of unpredictability. Unpredictability threatens control, and control is all anyone has right now. As this chapter nears its end, the son stands at the edge of a dangerous realization. If the story has outrun evidence, then waiting for evidence to catch up may be pointless. The only way to slow a runaway narrative is to introduce friction. And friction comes from complication, from questions that don't have easy answers, from names that don't fit neatly into villain roles, from structures that resist simplification. The whispered list could do that. But once introduced, it can't be retracted. Once the story widens, it won't narrow again. And the son knows this. He understands the cost, not just to himself, but to everyone whose name hovers near the narrative. As the chapter closes, one final thought settles in. Stories outrun evidence because people let them. Because fear prefers certainty to truth. Because outrage feels better than patience. And once that engine starts, only something equally disruptive can stop it. Which brings us to the moment when the whispered list is no longer just a rumor. It becomes a decision. And the consequences of that decision will ripple far beyond the son himself. What do you do when every option feels wrong? That's the question hanging in the air as this chapter opens. Not shouted, not debated, just sitting there heavy. Because now the son understands something he didn't before. There is no version of this story where he walks away untouched. Silence will be interpreted as guilt. Speaking will be interpreted as manipulation. Waiting will be interpreted as calculation. Every path carries consequences. And when every path feels dangerous, morality stops being theoretical. It becomes urgent. In this fictional reconstruction, the son spends long hours alone, replaying the same question from different angles. Is it right to name people who may never have intended harm? Is it right to remain silent when silence has already reshaped the narrative? Is protecting others still virtuous when they won't protect you? These questions don't have clean answers, and that's what makes them unbearable. Because morality is easiest when it aligns with self-interest. Here it doesn't. The whispered list now feels like a loaded object, not just because of what it contains, but because of what it implies. That responsibility can be shared. That influence matters. That silence has consequences. But naming names doesn't just redistribute scrutiny. It redistributes pain. And the son knows this. He's not naive about the fallout. He knows that even suggesting involvement, even moral involvement, can stain reputations permanently. He knows that association can ruin careers, relationships, legacies. And that knowledge stops him cold. Because no matter how isolated he feels, he still sees these people as human, flawed, fearful, complex, not villains. And that's where the moral dilemma sharpens. If no one is a villain, then what does accountability look like? In this dramatized narrative, the son realizes that society loves clear villains. Clear villains make stories manageable. They allow outrage without reflection. But this story doesn't offer